Look at my poor ex. Still broke, still a nobody after all these years. And an imaginary wife? Oh. Still poor, still alone. Did you invent a wife just to save face, Montrell?
3 years now. You still hasn't changed, have you?
Then where is this mystery wife? Or does she only exist in your head?
She's on her way.
Sure she is. Inventing an entire marriage, almost sad.
I run a construction and infrastructure company. We just closed a contract with the city.
She had no idea. 2 days earlier, the man standing in front of her had signed a $412 million infrastructure contract with the city of Chicago. My name is Montrell Kane. I'm 42 years old, and I've spent most of my life believing one simple thing: that a man's worth isn't in what people say about him at a party. It's in what he builds when nobody's watching. 20 years in construction taught me that. Marriage taught me it twice as hard. 8 years ago, my ex-wife walked out of our house on the south side of Chicago with 2 suitcases and a look on her face like she'd already moved on before she packed the first one. I didn't chase her down Halsted Street. I didn't call her family begging for a second chance. I let her go, and I went quiet. Some folks mistake quiet for broken. They're never the same thing. Which brings me to a Saturday night in October, in the grand ballroom of the Chicago Marriott downtown Magnificent Mile on Michigan Avenue, at our high school reunion. The first one I'd bothered to attend since the divorce. I was sitting near the back with a glass of ice water, listening to my ex-wife's laugh carry across the room the way it always used to when she thought she'd won something. "Look at Montrell over there," Titilayo said, loud enough for half the ballroom to catch it. Still wearing that same tired face. 8 years since the divorce, and the man's still alone. Some men just never climb out of the hole they dig for themselves. Her friends laughed. Somebody I didn't recognize added, "Didn't he used to talk about building something big? Guess all that's left is the ego and a tool belt." I didn't answer. I just watched. And here's the part nobody in that ballroom knew yet. The part I need you to sit with for a second before we go any further. 2 days before that reunion, my legal team sent over the final paperwork on a $412 million infrastructure contract with the city of Chicago. 18 months of work, coming down to one last signature. My name was on that paperwork. Not a company name. Mine. Titilayo didn't know that. But there was a second thing happening in that ballroom that night, something even I didn't fully understand yet. A man standing beside my ex-wife who kept glancing at my watch instead of my face. Not admiring it, measuring it. Like he was trying to solve a math problem he didn't want anybody to know he was working on. Before we get into the story, I want you to remember something my grandmother used to say on her porch on 79th Street, rocking in that old chair that had been creaking since Eisenhower was president. "Baby, the folks who talk the loudest about your failures are usually the ones most afraid you're about to prove them wrong." She was right about a lot of things. She was right about this. Let me take you back 2 days earlier to a quieter moment, because that's really where this story starts. It was a gray Chicago Thursday, the kind of sky that can't decide if it wants to rain. I was in my truck on Lakeshore Drive, coffee going cold in the cup holder, when the invitation buzzed through on my phone. My old friend Efe had been the one pushing me to go. "You've spent 8 years building your life back up in silence, Montrell," she said over the phone, that same no-nonsense tone she'd had since 10th grade. "Go to that reunion, not to prove anything, just to close the door properly." I almost said no. I'd built a good, quiet life, a home in the Gold Coast, a wife who loved me steady and sure, work that mattered. I didn't need Titilayo's approval to feel like a man. But something in me wanted to walk back into that room one time, not as the man who left broken, but simply as myself. So Saturday night, I put on a plain charcoal suit, no flash, no statement. I drove to the Marriott alone. Ash had a foundation board meeting running late. She runs an education fund for kids across the South and West Sides, work she cares about more than any gala or reunion. And she told me she'd catch up with me there. The Marriott's lobby smelled like fresh-cut flowers and expensive coffee. A jazz trio played low near the elevators, something slow and brassy that made the whole place feel like it was holding its breath before a show. Outside, rain had started tapping soft against the windows overlooking Michigan Avenue, the streetlights blurring gold and red on the wet pavement below. I straightened my jacket in the elevator mirror, took one slow breath, and reminded myself why I'd come. Not to prove a single thing, just to close a door that had been left cracked open for 8 long years. I walked into that ballroom under gold chandeliers and low jazz, and the first face I saw was Titilayo's. She smiled at me, the way people smile when they think they've already won. "Well, look who decided to show up," she said, stepping closer, drink in hand, her voice pitched just loud enough for the room. "Still alone, Montrell? Or are you still out there swinging a hammer for a living, hoping somebody notices?" I looked her dead in the eye. Calm. Steady. "No," I said. "I'm married." For one full second, the whole cluster of old classmates around her went quiet. Then Titilayo laughed. A big, performative laugh, the kind meant to convince a room before it convinces the person laughing. Nobody in that ballroom believed me yet. They had no idea how wrong they were about to be proven. Or how fast. If you've ever walked back into a room full of people who counted you out, stay with me, because what happened next in that ballroom is the part nobody saw coming. Titilayo threw her head back and laughed louder. "Married? That's rich, Montrell, truly." She turned to the circle of old classmates gathered around her, like she needed witnesses for whatever came next. "Y'all hear this? Montrell says he's married. A man who couldn't build a stable life in 8 years suddenly got a wife nobody's ever heard of." I kept my voice even. 3 years now. 3 years, she repeated, like the words tasted strange in her mouth. "And where is this mystery wife tonight? Home? Or maybe she doesn't exist outside your head." Standing beside her was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, groomed within an inch of his life, a suit that cost more than it fit him. Corbin. I'd learn his name soon enough. What I noticed first wasn't his face. It was his eyes. They kept dropping to my wrist, to the plain steel watch I'd worn every day for 6 years, the one that used to belong to my father. He wasn't looking at it the way a man looks at something he likes. He was looking at it the way a man looks at a number he's trying to calculate. "She's finishing up a meeting," I said simply. "She'll be here soon." Titilayo waved a hand like she was swatting away a fly. "Still nothing, Montrell. Still poor. Still alone, even if you've invented somebody to sit next to you tonight." I let that land and pass through me without taking root. Anger is a poor tenant. You let it stay too long, it stops paying rent and starts tearing up the walls. I'd learned that the hard way. Because the truth is, Titilayo's words dragged me somewhere I hadn't let myself go in years. I remembered a night on the south side. Rain coming down so hard it bounced off the pavement outside a downtown conference center. I was standing under a thin jacket, soaked through, waiting on Titilayo to finish a networking event for a certification program she wanted badly. I'd sold my grandfather's set of framing tools 2 weeks earlier. The good steel ones, the ones I'd used to put myself through my first construction jobs, just so she could afford the enrollment fee. I never told her where the money came from, I didn't need her gratitude. I needed her to have a shot at something better. When she finally came outside that night and saw me standing there, drenched to the bone, she didn't say thank you. She looked at me like I was an inconvenience and said, "Why do you look so pathetic right now?" I said nothing then. I said nothing that whole marriage, most nights. I thought silence was patience. I know better now. There were other nights like that one, smaller in size but not in weight. The year I picked up double shifts on a warehouse renovation in Bridgeport just to cover the deposit on her sister's wedding gift, and she told her mother it had been her idea, her money. The Thanksgiving I drove 4 hours round trip to fix her cousin's water heater for free because it makes the family look good, and came home to a cold plate on the counter and a closed bedroom door. None of it had felt like sacrifice at the time. It had felt like love, the only way I knew how to speak it. I understand now that a man can pour his whole self into a cup somebody else has already decided not to drink from. Corbin leaned toward Titilayo and murmured something I couldn't quite hear, his eyes flicking to me again. A quick, calculating glance, gone as fast as it came. Titilayo didn't seem to notice. She was too busy performing for an audience that was slowly losing interest. "My wife had a late meeting downtown," I said again, steady. "She'll be here." "Sure she will," Titilayo said, rolling her eyes toward her friends for approval. "A whole imaginary wife. That's almost sad, Montrell. Almost." I checked the time. Esh's meeting should have wrapped 20 minutes ago. Titilayo just humiliated a man in front of an entire ballroom over a wife she was certain didn't exist. Team Montrell, staying silent and letting the truth do the talking. Or Team Titilayo, because at least she says exactly what she thinks? Comment Team Montrell or Team Titilayo. Pick one. We're counting. Titilayo turned back to me, emboldened by her friend's laughter. "You know what the saddest part is? You actually thought you'd amount to something. All that talk back in school about building something real. And look at you. Same tired suit, same tired face. Some men just don't have it in them." I thought about all the years I'd spent believing that if I just worked hard enough, long enough, quiet enough, she'd eventually see me. I thought about the man I used to be, standing outside that conference center in the rain, believing his worth was something he had to earn one soaked, silent night at a time. I wasn't that man anymore. I hadn't been for a long time. Titilayo just hadn't gotten the memo. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being underestimated by somebody for so many years that it starts to feel like weather, something you just live under instead of something you fight. I'd stopped fighting it a long time ago. Not because I gave up, but because I'd found something better to spend my energy on, building a life so steady and so quiet that it no longer needed anyone's belief to stand up straight. Titilayo's words that night didn't wound me the way they might have 8 years earlier. They just told me, clearly, how little had changed on her side of the room, while everything had changed on mine. "You should slow down," I said quietly, not unkind, just factual. "You're about to say something you can't take back." She laughed again, but this time it had an edge underneath it, a flicker of something uncertain crossing behind her eyes for just a second before her performance smoothed back over it. "Slow down," she said. "Montrell, I have absolutely nothing to slow down for. I have my life together. I have Corbin." She reached for his arm, pulling him half a step closer, presenting him like an exhibit. "And you have what? A tool belt and an imaginary wife?" Behind her, I noticed a woman I recognized from our senior year. Jendai, sharp-eyed, quiet, the kind of person who never spoke until she had something worth saying, watching the whole exchange with her arms folded and her jaw set tight. Back in high school, she'd been the one who'd tell you the truth about your science project, even when everybody else said it was fine. These days, she worked compliance audits for a firm that handled vendor verification on municipal contracts, the kind of job that meant she noticed the details most people never thought to look for. Some things about a person don't change over the years. I was grateful in that moment that this was one of them. She caught my eye across the room. She didn't smile. She gave the smallest nod, like she already knew something the rest of the room didn't. I thought about F.A.'s voice on the phone 2 days earlier, telling me to go close the door properly. I hadn't understood, standing in my truck on Lakeshore Drive, just how many doors in that ballroom were about to swing open at once. Some doors, once you finally walk through them, don't close quietly behind you. They come off the hinges entirely. Somewhere near the entrance, I heard the low murmur of a door opening, footsteps on marble, and a shift in the air of the room. The particular kind of quiet that falls over a crowd right before it turns to face something. Titilayo hadn't heard it yet. She was still talking, still laughing, still certain the ground beneath her was solid. It wasn't. Not anymore. Somebody had just walked through that door, and Titilayo's whole night was about to change because of it. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened fully, and the low jazz seemed to dim half a step, the way a room does when it decides, without being told, that something important just walked in. Ish. She wore a deep midnight blue gown, her curls swept up high, moving through that ballroom the way people move when they've never once needed a room's permission to belong in it. Heads turned. A woman near the bar whispered to her friend, just loud enough for me to catch it. "Is that Ish Kane, the one who runs the education fund for the South and West Side schools?" Titilayo turned to see what everyone else was looking at. I watched the color drain slowly from her face. Ish crossed the room straight to me, took my hand in both of hers, and pressed a kiss to my cheek in front of everyone. "Sorry I'm late, baby," she said, warm and unhurried. "That meeting ran long." Titilayo's cruelty that night was never really about me. It was insurance against a fear she'd carried since our marriage ended, that trading a loyal man for status might have been the worst decision of her life, and she needed a room full of witnesses to help her believe otherwise. Mocking me loudly, in front of people who still remembered our wedding, wasn't confidence. It was a performance for herself as much as for anyone watching. Esh walking through that door wasn't just a surprise to her. It was the exact fear she'd spent 8 years outrunning, finally catching up to her in the one room she couldn't leave. Titilayo's mouth opened, then closed. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its edge. "Oh, so you're Montrell's wife?" Before Ish answered, she leaned in close enough that only I could hear her. "Jindai called me on my way over," she murmured. "She's here, and I just got the notification. The infrastructure contract closed this afternoon. That last signature finally came through. 412 million. Done." I felt that land quiet and steady in my chest, the way good news does when you've stopped needing it to prove anything to anyone but yourself. Ish straightened, turned to Titilayo, and answered her question directly, no performance in it at all. "Yes, I'm his wife, and I'm very proud of my husband." My wife. Not a rumor, not an invention. Standing right there in a room that had spent the last 20 minutes calling her imaginary. The room had gone almost silent. A few feet away, someone's champagne glass hovered halfway to their mouth, forgotten. Titilayo tried to recover, forcing a laugh that came out thin and unconvincing. "Well, that's wonderful. I had no idea Montrell had—" She stopped, glanced at me, then back at Esh. "Had someone like you." "Most people don't take the time to find out what someone actually has," Esh said, still calm, still warm, no malice in it. Just fact. Most people don't take the time to find out what someone actually has, Esh said, still calm, still warm, no malice in it, just fact. I thought, standing there, about the first time I'd met Esh 3.5 years earlier at a community fundraiser in Bronzeville, where she'd been quietly writing checks nobody had asked her to write and fixing problems nobody had asked her to fix. She hadn't known who I was that night either. She'd simply watched me help an elderly man carry folding chairs back to a supply closet after the event ended, long after anyone with something to prove would have already gone home. And she'd said, "Most men leave once the cameras stop." I told her I wasn't most men. She said she'd believe that when she saw it proven over time, not over one night. It took 2 years of steady, unremarkable Tuesdays for her to finally believe it. That's the thing nobody in that ballroom understood about either of us. We hadn't built what we had on a single grand gesture. We'd built it the way I built everything else in my life, one honest day at a time, with nobody watching, until eventually somebody did. I watched something shift behind Titilayo's eyes. Not full understanding yet, but the first crack in the foundation. She looked at me, really looked, maybe for the first time in 8 years, and I could see her running numbers she didn't have access to. The tailored suit that wasn't flashy, but wasn't cheap either. The watch Corbin kept eyeing. The woman standing next to me, who half the room recognized on sight. "So," Titilayo said carefully, testing the ground, "what exactly do you do now, Montrell? Still in construction?" "I run a construction and infrastructure company," I said simply. "We just closed a contract with the city. I didn't say the number. I didn't need to. Some truths don't need volume. They just need time to sink in." Corbin shifted his weight beside Titilayo, and for the first time all night, he looked genuinely uneasy. He'd spent the whole evening measuring me up like a problem to be solved, and now the math wasn't adding up the way he'd expected. A man who reads other people for a living, for whatever living he actually made, knows the exact moment a room turns against him. Corbin knew it. He just wasn't ready to admit it yet. He leaned toward Titilayo and said something low, just for her. But I caught the tail end of it. Didn't say anything about him actually having money. Titilayo shot him a sharp look, a silent warning to keep his voice down. But it was too late. I'd heard enough to understand that whatever Corbin had promised her, it had never once accounted for the possibility that I might be the one standing taller by the end of the night. That's great," Titilayo said, her voice climbing an octave too high. "Really great, Montrell. I'm happy for you." She didn't sound happy. She sounded like a woman watching the floor tilt slowly beneath her heels. I thought about the version of myself who used to stand in rooms like this, waiting for exactly this kind of validation, the moment someone finally looked impressed. I used to think that moment would feel like winning. It didn't. It felt like nothing at all, which was its own kind of freedom. Esh's hand stayed warm in mine. Across the room, Jendai was still watching, arms folded, waiting for something. I didn't know yet exactly what she knew. I only knew, from the look on her face, that Titilayo's night was not close to being over. "You know," Titilayo said, trying to steady herself, forcing brightness back into her voice, "we should all catch up properly. Corbin and I would love to hear more about the business, wouldn't we, Corbin?" Corbin didn't answer right away. He was still watching me the way a man watches a door he suspects is about to open onto something he doesn't want walked through. I looked at Titilayo, and for just a moment I felt something close to pity. Not for the woman who'd mocked me 20 minutes earlier, but for the version of her that still hadn't realized how much bigger this moment was about to get. She'd spent the whole night building a story about how far I'd fallen, and she was still, even now, trying to find a way to make that story true. It's a strange thing, watching someone cling to a version of you that stopped existing years ago, the way a person keeps reaching for a light switch in a room they don't realize has already been remodeled. She still doesn't know how much she doesn't know, I thought. A server passed with a tray of champagne, and somewhere behind me I heard someone murmur the name of the scholarship fund at our old high school. The one I'd funded quietly for 6 years. The one nobody in that room, including Titilayo, had ever connected to my name. Jendai had heard it too. She glanced at me once, like she was asking permission. I gave her the smallest nod back. Whatever she was about to say, Titilayo's night was about to get a great deal harder. She thought the hardest part of the evening was already behind her. She had no idea it hadn't even started yet. Jendai didn't wait for an invitation. She crossed the room with the steady, unhurried stride of someone who'd been waiting years for the right moment to say something out loud. "Titilayo," she said, her voice carrying clean and clear across the circle of onlookers. "That's enough." Titilayo blinked at her, caught off guard. "Jendai, this doesn't concern you." "It does, actually." Jendai's arms stayed folded, her tone level, unshaken. "Because some of us have known for years exactly what kind of man Montreal is, and we've watched you build an entire evening around pretending otherwise." She paused, letting the room settle into full silence. "What most people in this ballroom don't know is that for the last 6 years, Montreal has quietly funded the entire scholarship endowment at our old high school. Every single one of those scholarship kids you've all clapped for at the alumni dinners, that's him. He never put his name on a plaque. He never told anyone, not even me. I found out by accident going through the fund's paperwork last spring." A ripple moved through the crowd, heads turning, voices dropping into murmurs. Someone near the back said, "Wait, that's been Montreal this whole time?" Montreal felt something tighten and loosen in his chest at once. He thought of the first check he'd written 6 years earlier, alone at his kitchen table past midnight, telling himself it didn't need his name attached to matter. He'd expected pride hearing it said aloud in front of a room. Instead, he felt oddly exposed, like a door he'd kept locked out of habit had swung open without his permission. He didn't reach for credit. He never had. Titilayo's face had gone pale, her mouth slightly open, no comeback ready. Jendai wasn't finished. She turned, deliberately, toward Corbin. "And you," she said, "might want to sit this next part out. Quietly. Because I know exactly what you tried to do to Montreal's company 2 years ago. The falsified subcontractor bid. The shell paperwork routed through a fake vendor account to try and skim off a city project. It didn't work because Montreal's team caught it before it went anywhere. But I have no doubt Titilayo knew. Didn't you, Titilayo? You covered for him." The color left Titilayo's face entirely. She turned to Corbin, her voice cracking. "You told me that was a misunderstanding. You said—" "Don't," Corbin said flatly, stepping back half a step, distancing himself in real time. "Don't make this about me right now." His hand had gone tight around his glass, knuckles pale against the crystal, the practiced ease sliding off his face for just a half second, replaced by something colder and more calculating. It was the same look he'd worn all night studying Montreal's watch. A man running numbers on an exit, not an apology. A woman near the punch table murmured to her husband, "I always wondered how Corbin afforded that condo on nothing but consulting fees." Word travels fast in a room that's already decided to stop being polite. F.A. appeared at my elbow sometime in the middle of it, having crossed the room the moment things started to unravel. She didn't say anything right away, just stood there with her arms crossed, watching Titilayo the way you'd watch weather rolling in that you'd already predicted years ago. "I told you closing the door properly might take the door off its hinges," she murmured to me, low enough that only I could hear. I almost laughed. Almost. Titilayo, still reeling, turned back toward the small circle of old classmates who'd egged her on all night, searching their faces for the same laughter that had backed her up 20 minutes earlier. She found none of it. A few of them had already started drifting toward the bar, suddenly very interested in refreshing their drinks. Corbin stepping back from her wasn't just betrayal. It confirmed the one fear Titilayo had never said out loud, not even to herself. That she'd left real loyalty behind for a man who was never actually loyal to anything but his own comfort. Her deepest desire had always been simple: to never again feel like the woman standing outside in the rain, waiting on someone else's ambition to notice her. But choosing status over substance meant defending a man who, the second the room turned against him, wouldn't defend her back. That contradiction is what broke her in front of everyone. Not the accusation itself, but the proof that she'd built her whole second chance on exactly the kind of abandonment she thought she'd escaped. Titilayo turned back to me, desperation replacing the arrogance that had carried her through the whole evening. "Montrell, you knew about this? About Corbin's scheme, and you never said anything?" "I knew," I said quietly. "My legal team caught it. We handled it without needing to make a scene." She stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time in 8 years. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Ish answered before I could, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Because there's something else you should know, Titilayo. Montrell knew about you and Corbin long before the divorce was ever filed. Years before." The room went still enough that I could hear the ice shifting in someone's glass 3 feet away. Titilayo's eyes went wide, then filled, her composure finally breaking all the way through. "You knew? This whole time?" I nodded once. I knew. "Then why didn't you say something? Why did you just let it happen?" "Because for a long time," I said, my voice steady, no anger left in it, just plain truth. "I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, worked hard enough, you'd eventually choose me on your own. I didn't want to force it. I wanted you to see me." I paused. "You never did. And eventually, I stopped needing you to." Titilayo turned to Corbin one last time, her voice breaking into something raw and unguarded. "You told me you'd give me the life Montrell never could. You said I'd never have to worry again. What happened to all of that?" Corbin looked at her with something close to contempt. "Don't put that on me right now." "Don't put it on you!" Her voice cracked louder now, past the point of caring who heard. "I lied for you. I told my own mother that condo was legitimate. I told everyone in this room tonight that you were the better choice." She was shaking now, the champagne flute in her hand trembling hard enough that a little of it spilled over the rim and onto her wrist. She didn't seem to notice. Corbin straightened his jacket, already halfway to leaving in his mind, if not yet in his feet. "That sounds like a you problem, Titilayo." Somewhere behind me, I heard someone whisper, not unkindly, "Lord have mercy." The way older folks do when they've just watched a slow-motion collision they saw coming from a mile off. The crowd around them had thinned considerably, people quietly stepping back, drifting away from the wreckage, no one wanting to be standing too close when the rest of it came down. A few of the old classmates who'd been laughing loudest 20 minutes earlier were now studying their shoes, or their drinks, or the middle distance, anywhere but Titilayo's face. I stood there with my wife's hand in mine, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just a quiet, settled kind of stillness. The feeling of a door finally closing all the way after being left cracked open for 8 long years. I thought about all the nights I'd imagined this moment differently. Imagined myself saying something cutting, something that would land the way her words used to land on me. Standing there in that ballroom, the words never came, and I realized I didn't want them to. There's a version of justice that shouts, and there's a version that simply stands still while the truth does the work for you. I'd spent 8 years learning the difference. Titilayo wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at the wreckage of her own evening, scattered across the marble floor of a ballroom on Michigan Avenue, in front of everyone she'd once wanted so badly to impress. Jindai stepped back beside me for a moment, her voice low, just for us. I probably should have said something years ago. You said it exactly when it needed saying, I told her, not a minute before. F.A. squeezed my shoulder once, a small, wordless gesture that said more than any speech could have. Some friendships don't need much said out loud. They just need someone standing next to you when the ground shifts. I didn't feel the need to say anything else to Titilayo. There was nothing left to prove, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Titilayo had walked into that ballroom sure of exactly who had lost and who had won. She was about to spend the rest of the night learning how wrong she'd been. I didn't wait around for the rest of it to play out. I turned to Ish, and without a word passing between us, we both understood it was time to go. Behind me, I heard Titilayo's voice, thinner now, stripped of every ounce of performance it had carried all night. Montrell, wait. Please, just wait a second. I didn't turn around. We walked out of the Chicago Marriott downtown Magnificent Mile into a clear October night. Michigan Avenue quiet except for the occasional taxi rolling past and the wind coming soft off the lake. I opened the car door for Ish, the way I always do, and we drove north along the Magnificent Mile, past the storefronts glowing gold in the evening light, toward home in the Gold Coast. Neither of us spoke for a few blocks. I kept both hands steady on the wheel, watching the lit-up storefronts slide by. A bakery closing up for the night. A doorman under an awning checking his phone. Ordinary Chicago going about its ordinary evening, entirely unaware of what had just happened 3 blocks south. There's something grounding about a city that keeps moving, no matter what's just fallen apart or come together inside one of its ballrooms. I thought about her father then, a retired electrician who'd spent 30 years wiring houses on the West Side before his knees finally gave out on him. She'd told me once, early on, that she hadn't fallen for me despite the tool belt. She'd fallen for me because of it. Because she'd grown up watching a man come home with calloused hands and call that a good day's work. It wasn't nostalgia when she said it, it was recognition. Esh finally broke the silence, her hand resting lightly on my arm. You never told me the whole story, she said. About knowing, about the notebook. I glanced at her. What notebook? The one in the bottom drawer of your old desk, she said gently. I found it 2 years ago, cleaning out the study. Pages and pages of things Titilayo used to say to you. Every insult, every put-down. Dated, almost like you were keeping records. She paused. I never brought it up. I wasn't angry. I just didn't understand it, not until tonight. I kept my eyes on the road for a moment before answering. I wasn't keeping it to use against her. I was keeping it so I wouldn't forget who I used to let define me. I exhaled slowly. Every time I thought about giving up on myself, I'd read a page. Not for the sting of it, for the reminder, never again. I could still recall the exact weight of that notebook in my palm on nights I don't like remembering. Flipping to a page dated some ordinary Tuesday, reading her old words back to myself like scripture I needed to disprove. It never once made me hate her. It just made sure I never mistook her voice for my own. Esh squeezed my hand. You could have thrown it away tonight, after all that. I might now, I said. I think I finally don't need it anymore. Outside, the lake wind pushed faint static through the cracked window, and neither of us spoke for a moment. I thought about all the nights that notebook had been the only honest conversation I was having with anyone, myself included. Strange, carrying proof of your own worth for years without ever showing it to the one person who might have shared the weight of it. My phone buzzed once in my jacket pocket at a red light on Oak Street. I glanced at it out of habit more than curiosity. A text from a number I hadn't saved, though I recognized it instantly. Titilayo. I'm sorry. For tonight. For a lot of things. I looked at it for a long moment, the light still red, the wipers ticking once across a windshield that didn't need it. Ish glanced over, not asking, just present. You don't have to answer that tonight, she said quietly, or ever if you don't want to. I know, I said. I put the phone face down in the cup holder. Some doors don't need slamming shut. You can just let them ease closed on their own weight. And that's its own kind of answer. We didn't say much else the rest of the drive. Some silences don't need filling. They're already complete on their own. The streetlights along Lakeshore Drive blurred past in long gold streaks, and somewhere out past the buildings, I could just make out the dark line of the lake against a darker sky. Chicago has a way of looking especially honest at night. No pretense left in it, just the water and the wind and whatever's true underneath. I rolled the window down an inch, just enough to let the cold lake air in, and something about it felt like exhaling a breath I'd been holding since a ballroom 3 miles behind us. When we pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on, the way Esh always leaves it, warm and steady against the dark. I sat in the car for a second longer than I needed to, just taking it in. The quiet street, the house we'd built a real life inside of, my wife waiting beside me instead of walking ahead of me. You okay? She asked. Yeah, I said, and I meant it. I think I actually am. Inside, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the house settle around me, the furnace kicking on somewhere below, the small, ordinary sounds of a life that had nothing left to prove to anybody. Esh went to put the kettle on, the way she does most nights, whether we need tea or not. It's less about the tea and more about the ritual of it, the 10 quiet minutes standing together in the kitchen before the day's finally allowed to end. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same worn oak table we'd bought secondhand our first year together, the one with a faint water ring near the edge that Esh always says gives it character. And I thought about Titilayo standing in that ballroom, the wreckage of her evening scattered around her heels. I thought about Corbin stepping back from her without a second thought. I thought about 8 years of silence, of quiet work, of choosing not to explain myself to anyone who'd already decided who I was. I thought, too, about the man I used to be at this same table, back when it sat in a smaller apartment on the south side, doing math in his head at 2 in the morning, trying to figure out how to make a single paycheck stretch across 2 people's expectations. That man would not have believed this kitchen, this quiet, this woman across the table from him. I was grateful sitting there that I hadn't needed him to believe it. I'd just needed to keep showing up for it, one ordinary evening at a time, until it became real enough to sit inside of. I thought about my grandmother's porch on 79th Street, the way she used to say a man's worth lives in what he builds when nobody's watching. I'd spent 8 years testing whether that was true, half hoping it wasn't. Sitting at that steady oak table, I finally believed her all the way through. Not as a saying anymore, but as something lived. Esh set 2 mugs down, sat across from me, and didn't ask me anything else that night. She just let the quiet sit there with us, comfortable and unhurried, the way good quiet does between 2 people who've already said the parts that mattered. Sitting there with the kitchen lamp humming low and Esh's hands wrapped loosely around her mug, I understood something the ballroom would never see. Everyone back at that reunion would remember the gasps, Titilayo's face going pale, the whole spectacle of it. But none of that was actually the part that mattered to me. What mattered was this: an ordinary, quiet kitchen at the end of an extraordinary night. A woman across the table who'd never once needed me to prove anything to earn her love, and enough peace in my own chest that I didn't feel the pull to replay a single second of what had just happened 3 miles south of here. I was simply, finally, home. But there was still one conversation left to have. The one that would finally put the whole 8 years to rest. The next morning, I stood out on the back porch with a cup of coffee, looking out toward the trees a few blocks over that lead down to Grant Park. The sky doing that pale, washed-out gray Chicago does so well in October. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's dog barked twice at the mail carrier and then thought better of it. Ordinary sounds, ordinary morning, the kind I used to take for granted before I understood how rare a peaceful morning actually is. Esh came out a few minutes later, wrapped in the old cardigan she refuses to throw away, no matter how many new ones I buy her, and handed me a second cup, even though I already had one going cold in my hand. She always says a cold cup of coffee is just a reminder to slow down, not a mistake to fix. She stood beside me a while before she spoke. "You knew about the affair for years before the divorce," she said quietly. "You stayed anyway. You kept trying." "I did," I said. "Why?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. Because I believed if I was successful enough, patient enough, quiet enough, she'd eventually see what she had. I thought if I proved myself, she'd finally choose me the way I chose her. I took a slow sip of coffee, watching the steam curl up into the cold air. But somewhere along the way, I stopped needing her to see it. I just needed to see it myself. Esh studied me for a moment, the way she does when she's about to ask the real question underneath the question. "Do you hate her? After everything?" I smiled, small but real. The first easy smile I think I'd let myself have since the night before. "No," I said. "I forgave her a long time ago." What I hadn't forgiven, not until last night, was the version of myself who used to believe he had to earn the right to be loved. The man standing in the rain outside that conference center, thinking soaked shoes and an empty wallet were the price of being worth something. I shook my head slowly. I don't owe anybody proof anymore. Not her, not that ballroom, not even myself. Esh leaned her head against my shoulder, and we stood there a long while, coffee going lukewarm in our hands, watching the wind move through the trees toward Grant Park. The biggest win of the night before hadn't been watching Titilayo's world come apart in that ballroom. It wasn't the scholarship reveal, or Corbin's fraud finally seeing daylight, or even the moment Esh walked in wearing that deep blue dress and turned every head in the room. The real win was quieter than all of that. It was standing on my own back porch the next morning, coffee in hand, my wife beside me, finally free of the need for anyone's applause. No ballroom gives you that. No confrontation, no scholarship reveal, no perfectly timed entrance in a midnight blue dress can hand you that kind of peace. You have to build it yourself, morning by ordinary morning, long after anyone's watching to see whether you will. I thought about the notebook still sitting in that bottom drawer, and I decided, standing there in the cold morning air, that I would finally let it go. Not in anger, not as some symbolic gesture for anyone else to witness, but quietly, the way I'd done most things that actually mattered in my life. Some chapters don't need a dramatic close. They just need you to stop turning back to reread them. Later that afternoon, I called Effie to thank her properly for pushing me to go. "You knew, didn't you," I said, "that something like this might happen?" "I didn't know the details," she laughed. "I just knew you were finally ready to stop carrying it alone." Then, softer, Your grandmother would have been proud of how you handled that room, Montrell. Calm as still water. She used to tell me patience wasn't the same as doing nothing, I said. Took me about 20 years to understand what she meant by that. Most of us take 20 years to understand the things our grandmothers said in about 10 seconds, F.A. said, and I could hear the smile in it. That's just how wisdom works. It waits for you. I sat with that a while after we hung up. Some inheritances aren't money or land. Some of them are simply the way a person taught you to carry yourself when the whole room is waiting for you to break. This story reminds us that real healing rarely arrives with fireworks. It shows up in small, deliberate rituals that put your hands to work before grief or doubt gets the chance to spiral. If you're missing someone tonight, pull out the chipped mug you both used on that road trip to the Grand Canyon. Set it on the kitchen table at 7 o'clock, and write 3 things you still love about him in a blue spiral notebook from the drugstore. If Saturday mornings have felt too quiet since retirement, invite the youngest grandchild over and bake something simple in your mother's old red Pyrex bowl, using the same wooden rolling pin that's outlasted 3 kitchens. If someone underestimates you at church or across a bridge table, you don't owe them a word of defense. Write it down instead. Fold the page in half and tuck it into the drawer where you keep the old birthday cards. Proof that you noticed and chose to move on anyway. Dignity at our age isn't a speech. It's a Tuesday spent tending your garden instead of tending someone else's opinion of you. It's the porch swing chosen over the argument. The phone call to your sister chosen over the urge to prove a point to somebody who made up their mind about you years ago. Montrell didn't win that night because he had more money than his ex-wife assumed. He won because he'd quietly built a life so steady it no longer needed her approval to stand up straight. That kind of peace is available to every one of us, one small, specific ritual at a time. The soul of these stories comes from human experience, empathy, and courage. AI assisted only in language refinement, so that timeless lessons of justice, compassion, and standing up against wrong could move and educate viewers everywhere. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.